Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I know we've got a very busy schedule today and tomorrow, and really appreciate your interest in this topic. Today's session, we're going to talk about brain computing interfaces. And we're going to talk about how it intersects with AR and VR and other emerging technology. This is a subject that Jeremy and I have talked about in the past, so excited to continue this discussion with him. We're going to talk about the privacy and ethical risks associated with this new technology. Jeremy Greenberg is our distinguished speaker today. He is Privacy Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum. And Jeremy, again, you and I have talked initially a few weeks back on a similar subject about an emerging technology, artificial intelligence and virtual reality, and some of the new privacy and security implications that are associated with this emerging technology. A related emerging technology with maybe more complicated privacy considerations is brain computing. I'm going to read a definition of brain computing, which I know you're very familiar with, but BCIs are computer-based systems that directly record, process, analyze, or modulate brain activity in the form of neurodata that is translated into an output command. Jeremy's going to make sense out of that for all of us and say it in plain English. But as a transition to that, the implications of brain computing are multifaceted in the health and wellness area, to be able to use it to diagnose medical conditions or control prosthetics, or in employment to monitor engagement or improvement or safety conditions. In education to track student attention or identify student needs, in smart cities to traffic control or communicate with connected vehicles, in the ever-present marketing area, neuromarketing, and using this technology to gauge consumer behavior, consumer interests, or even on a military implication for rehabilitation or for security purposes or lie detection. And so it's very far-reaching on where this technology goes. We're going to focus today on the technology, the use cases, and the current and potential privacy implications around this technology. So, Jeremy, we'll start off with an initial question. What exactly are brain computing interfaces, and how do they interact with neurodata? And what is neurodata?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Rick. And I really appreciate your introduction. And it's great to be joining you again, talking about emerging tech. So the definition that Rick provided, it's a very general definition of brain-computer interfaces. I would like to state that we don't really have standard definitions for things like brain-computer interfaces or neurotechnology or neurodata just yet. This technology is definitely out there, especially in the health and medical field, but it's still very much emerging, and we're really trying to wrap our minds, pun intended, around this technology and what it really is. So brain-computer interfaces, I think one way to think about the technology is to think about it in terms of what can this technology do? So you have brain-computer interfaces that can record neurodata. You have brain-computer interfaces that can modulate or stimulate neurodata, and you have those who can do both. So in terms of brain-computer interfaces that record neurodata, what exactly is being recorded? What is neurodata? So broadly, neurodata can be thought of as data generated by the nervous system, which consists of the electrical activities between neurons or proxies of this activity. So the recording of these interactions between neurons or between proxies of these neurons, obviously the brain is not an island unto itself. It very much impacts other bodily functions. So collecting this data relating to this electrical activity in the brain. And recording neurodata can be done for a number of reasons. In the consumer context, one of my favorite contexts, one of the most interesting contexts to me is gaming. The idea of a gamer involved in a virtual reality experience that's also collecting or recording their neurodata to measure things like engagement, how the user might feel about the game. Do they find it interesting? Are they bored? Are they getting frustrated? Are they enjoying the game? So you have these devices that record neurodata. You also have devices that modulate or stimulate neurodata, that are able to stimulate the human brain. And this is really found most typically in the health context. So for example, we have a history now of these devices being used successfully with Parkinson's patients, in which these devices are able to stimulate the patient's brain to help mitigate some of the symptoms. Then we have devices that do both. They can record and they can modulate or stimulate. And this is, again, used typically in that health context for patients who are recovering from stroke or patients who are recovering from spinal injury. So we have these sort of broad categories of brain-computer interfaces in terms of what they can do. Another, I think, really helpful way of thinking about brain-computer interfaces is to think about these computer systems as being either invasive or non-invasive. So by invasive, we're actually talking about surgery. The idea of having a device implanted into the human brain or on top of the human brain. Obviously, this is most typically used in the health or medical context. We don't have a lot of examples of folks installing these devices into their bodies for something like gaming or entertainment. Then you have non-invasive BCIs. And these are BCIs that don't involve high-risk surgery. And this can be achieved through various technologies such as EEG or FNIRS. So you typically have some sort of headband or cap that is placed on the user's head that is able to record this neurodata. Also, I think it's really important here to mention, Rick talked about some of the use cases, some of the sectors where we're seeing this technology, the fact that these devices can record or stimulate the human brain. It's really important, too, to talk about what these technologies cannot yet achieve. There's a lot of myths, a lot of fear, a lot of confusion surrounding this technology as being something of science fiction. But this technology is here today. What this technology cannot achieve is things like reading someone's exact innermost thoughts or pumping knowledge directly into someone's brain. I don't have the ability to become fluent in Japanese because I'm using some sort of brain-computer interface. That would be very nice, but we're not there yet. These devices they can't yet download someone's memories into a neatly curated archive. So I think it's really important to discuss not only what can these devices do today, what are their main use cases, but also what these devices cannot achieve today, because there is so much hype surrounding this technology.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. As you talk about the invasive versus non-invasive technologies, and you talk about the different use cases and the concept of neurodata, let's move this a little bit into the privacy realm. And there's a category of neurodata referred to as personal neurodata that can identify somebody. Can you talk about what that looks like and some of the things we should be thinking about?
Yeah, definitely. So when speaking to a number of technical experts in this field, neuroscientists, neuroethicists, as a privacy professional, I was very interested in whether or not someone could be identified based on their neurodata alone or in combination with other data, other biometric data, other PII. And a lot of the neuroscientists' responses were, well, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to identify someone based on this data? And I was like, well, what about something like marketing, or, what about, someone who is, playing a game, or, when it's associated with a particular student in the educational context. And their reaction was, It seems very feasible today to identify someone based solely on this neurodata. In many cases, it is quite unique. That really isn't being done today. However, this data is being combined with other PII associated with an individual. So it could be used to animate a profile about a person. It can serve as a persistent identifier for a patient. So we have these sort of identifiability questions related to this data. And that's why, some folks are starting to talk about personal neurodata. How does this fit within the paradigm of personally identifiable information? This data is a biometric, so it is in many ways very much sensitive. It relates to human biology. So it is a sensitive category of data. It likely would fall under the definition of biometrics under some privacy regimes we see out there, such as potentially CPRA or CCPA that have broad definitions of biometrics. So you have this identifiability question, but then you also have what I think of as perhaps even a greater privacy risk in this area is the ability to combine this data with other biometrics collected about an individual, other personal information, to really build a granular profile, to create a sort of intimate understanding of a person through the collection of this neurodata. And then I think privacy risks are really magnified when decisions are made based on the collection of this data. So for example, determining which content to serve or not to serve to a user based on this granular profile information, or determining, in real time, how to adjust an experience, an entertainment experience based on this neuro data. This would definitely be ripe for behavioral advertising, which could become increasingly granular based on the collection of this neuro data. So I think that a lot of the privacy implications, they definitely relate to identifiability, but also on these sorts of inferences and the decisions made based on this sensitive and novel biometric data.
Yeah, those are good points, Jeremy. As I think about the examples you just gave, they seem to be more on the benign side of privacy implications. But if I think of some of them that would have more dramatic impact, are the use of AI and machine learning to make decisions about the type of insurance you should get, or the type of promotion you should get, or the type of job you should get or not get, or the scholarship you get, or anything that would have real, sensitive implications to you. You alluded to some of the legislation that might be impactful here. On a federal level, we have sectoral laws like HIPAA and COPA and ECPA and the American Disabilities Act and even FERPA. On the state level now, we have California, who is starting to talk about how we handle things like this. On a global level, we have GDPR. How does one start to think about, how we play the game now, and what are we thinking about down the road for technologies like this?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question. As you said, Rick, we have, a number of these sectoral laws. We have, at the federal level, we have a number of state laws as well, in California, Virginia. We have, I think about this technology used in the educational context. We have so many different student privacy data protection laws in this country in all 50 states. So it really is a complicated web. And I think a lot of it starts with, understanding, the definition of biometrics often is what we can look at first. So if we're looking at, for example, state biometrics laws, and you're looking at BIPA, the Illinois biometrics law, it's very much, well-known, the well-known biometrics law in this country. It has a private right of action, but the definition of biometrics is quite narrow and would likely not include something like neurodata. On the other hand, the Washington State biometrics law is a lot broader and could include neurodata. So I think looking at definitions is really important here. And I think it's really important with all emerging technology to have those, at companies, when thinking about the commercial side of this technology, to have those conversations between developers and legal experts and policy experts about, okay, will this technology, is this being used in the workplace? Do we have to think about ECBA in that situation? Do we have to look at GDPR? So I think it's a really complicated landscape. I will say there are a few sort of neurotech or broader frameworks out there. The OECD has released its neurotechnology framework. This is soft law, but I think could be a good sort of guidance place, a place where we've seen some consensus around protections involving this data. And then looking at, again, AI and machine learning. In Europe, we have this proposed AI framework that includes biometrics. So looking at some of these broader frameworks and looking at some related technologies like AI and machine learning can help animate our understanding here. But it's a complex web, and yeah, we'll see where it goes. And even more complicated because this technology is very much out there today, but is very much still emerging. So we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, really interesting. So you sort of touched on my next question, but I'll ask you to think about this slightly differently. As you think about sort of the technical policy implications and how developers, how industry should be thinking about that, are we, privacy by design sort of disciplines, the ethical implications of the use of this data, the permissioning around this? What would be some good general advice that the sort of development community should be thinking about as they're building out and utilizing this technology for their myriad of use cases?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that like with other emerging technology, when we're talking about data, there have been some technical solutions and policy solutions proposed that I think would apply to the space. So things like privacy by design, thinking about providing granular controls to a user to exercise their rights over this data, providing on-off switches where appropriate. Some of these devices are always on necessarily in the health or medical context, but in the consumer context, maybe not. So providing a hard on-off switch. Things like encryption, dealing with sensitive biometric data at transit and at rest. So I think there are a number of sort of principles, best practices we can take from the emerging tech world and apply to this space. I also think there's some specifics here with neurotechnology. One relates to accuracy when dealing with this data. If we're making decisions based on new science that maybe hasn't been widely tested, making sure that the inferences or conclusions are accurate. One way to achieve that potentially with this technology is to take a hybridization approach. So having a BCI that maybe uses a few different methods to collect neurodata in combination with other data collection methods. So you could have a device that uses EEG, but also EMG, which is another collection method to maybe enhance accuracy. We could think about adaptive algorithms when using this technology. I think that because we are dealing with neurodata here, there's a lot of potential to use a lot of this data to repurpose it for data-driven research in the health and wellness context. So something like differential privacy as a method to sort of balance the utility of this data with privacy. So those are just some areas that I think that developers should be thinking about. And as always with this stuff, I think conversations are really important, and having that bi-directional conversation with experts, but also with the larger community when looking at these new technologies as a way to promote user privacy the way users see fit. And also thinking about things like notice and consent, which are always difficult questions with technology, perhaps even more difficult with this novel technology. So yeah, I think there is definitely a lot out there for developers, for policy folks, for regulators to think about in this space.
Yeah, well, lots to think about, and it's always reassuring to know that people like you and the FBF are thinking about these things and giving some guidance. In terms of guidance, and we're at the top of the hour, so we'll move to some questions. But I would say, some my general takeaways from this, like other emerging technologies, and how we think about this from a privacy point of view, or even just in general on how we're building our privacy programs. One, I think you need to get a good understanding of what are the benefits of the technology, and then juxtapose that against what are the associated risks. How do you mitigate those risks? How do you take into consideration the ethical considerations and the privacy considerations? How do you create best practices and policies and controls that set the rules and put the pieces together to make sure that stuff is doing right? And then, of course, being transparent with the appropriate notice and consent, I think, is a good way to approach this. And I think you've touched on a bunch of those points as best possible in a short period of time. We're almost at the top of the hour. We have a couple of questions in the chat. And so I will take them as they came in. The question is, which live cases should we read about today? And Jeremy mentioned can't yet download memories. To what extent has this capability been advanced?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in terms of live cases, I think a really great place to look whether someone is thinking more about the health context or the consumer context or enterprise context with these technologies is to definitely look at what's happening in the health and medical space. There are a few exceptions, but generally advancements, innovation in this field really happens first in that health space, and then we'll move into the commercial space, the enterprise space in some way. So I would say that's a really great place to look. A few really interesting examples that have come up recently is the expanse of patients using invasive brain-computer interfaces to control prosthetic limbs. There was a fascinating study that came out recently in which an invasive brain-computer interface was trained using AI and ML on a particular patient, so that that patient, when thinking about certain letters, was able to actually type using their brain. This is a fascinating use case. Definitely very limited, very specific, but I think that these are the places to look. In terms of downloading memories, the reason why I use that example, that's one of the promises from Elon Musk with his company Neuralink. Elon Musk's, his technology in this space is really impressive in a lot of ways. But from what he's shown so far, what's public, what's been demoed, we really can't see the downloading of memories as something to happen in the near future. There's so much opacity when thinking about neuroscience and what's happening in the brain. I've talked to some technical folks or folks from the medical space who say we'll never be able to do it. Others say we're so many decades off. So yeah, that no time soon, but in the future, it will certainly create some fascinating considerations.
Yep. I have time for one more question, and I'll encapsulate kind of two that relate to the same thing. And that's around risk. What are some of the key risks related to BCI research? And are there particular case studies you would recommend that we explore in this area?
Yeah, I think when it comes to BCI research and risks, I think one area to look at really relates to, and this is really more of a security risk, which I haven't talked about that as much during this session, but we have this risk of hacking devices. And this is especially prevalent when thinking about medical or health context. So a device that is being used to modulate a patient's brain to mitigate some health effects. The idea of something like that being hacked is a definite health risk, a public safety risk. And we do have examples out there of pacemakers being hacked. So the examples are there of these medical devices being hacked. So I think that there are a lot of security risks there, especially when it comes to modulating or stimulating the user's brain for some sort of purpose. One can imagine a bad actor even going in and a device that's able to modulate someone's brain to modulate that person's brain in a way that doesn't make sense or can cause some sort of irreparable harm. I think that that's definitely one of the most top of mind risks in this space.
Sounds like a Stanley Kubrick movie I saw a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. So so maybe sci-fi.
Yeah. Hopefully we've learned. We are at the top of the hour. Jeremy, it's always a pleasure. Time flies when we speak with you, and we could go on for a long time. I encourage folks that are on the session, if you have additional questions or want to schedule some more time with Jeremy and I offline, to do so. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Jeremy, again, for being a valued spokespartner and Wirewheel partner. It's always my great pleasure to speak with you. And Angie, I'll send it back to you to wrap us up.